Ross, welcome, and you will present on precarious work and social marginality across Europe. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, wait, this is not. Hold on one sec. Apologies. I'm not a Zoom person. We have Teams, unfortunately. Let's try this again. Okay. And share screen. There we go. Okay. Okay. There we go. And
I should have said, by the way, that you are a professor of sociology at the University of Limerick, but most people would know that, but Ross, the floor is yours.
thank you very much. So I'm delighted to be invited to this event. I've participated in on a couple of other occasions, and I think it's without question one of the most enriching experiences that I've had. It's just a wonderful group of people bringing together amazing research that sort of speaks to all the kind of critical issues in society. So hopefully I won't bring the discussion down too much. So this is a set of work that spans a number of different projects and a number of different papers, and it's really an effort to try and understand the large-scale transformations that have taken place in society around labor and labor relations. To make a really long story short, in the shift to industrial capitalism, we introduced all these new forms of classification that were based on occupation. The externalities of this was that it shaped and produced ideas like social class, it produced social differentiation, it produced political orientations. The concept of labor translating into a political party became something that has been an enduring part of the political landscape. It influenced the social networks that people had, it influenced where they lived and the types of communities they had, and really had a very strong imprint upon health and well-being. And interestingly, if you think about all these different areas, it really does span the social sciences and has defined what we've done for a lot of the last 120 years. Yet at the same time, when we were thinking about this idea of kind of occupation and its imprint, one of the things to recognize is that there's an assumption of stability, that somehow you could ask someone what they do, and that both has meaning and durability, which then translates into a social class or a social status that has meaning for people and it has meaning for society. The problem that's emerged is that there's been this rise with economic and social globalization, the rise of precarity in work. Where did this come from? It came from kind of heightened economic integration and more globalized markets, increased competition, greater opportunities for outsourcing of labor, typically to low-wage countries, and then this resulted in corresponding immigration and stronger migratory streams. Technological advances forced companies to become more competitive while simultaneously providing the mechanisms by which they could compete with one another. All of these things bundled together and essentially produced a new managerial logic. And we would argue that it's pretty much a global managerial logic, which is basically organized around the idea of greater flexibility in labor relations. And lots of people have written about this. Guy Standing's written some fascinating work, Arnie Kalleberg in the United States. Rogers was on the forefront of writing about non-standard work in Europe back in the late 1980s. So there's a large number of people that have sort of written about and theorized around this idea of crouching or encroaching precarity in work and labor. So the early work in the field focused on the spread of non-traditional employment. This typically meant non-indefinite contracts, but people sort of quickly pointed out that when you started talking about non-indefinite contracts, you suddenly see the generation of all sorts of other types of work conditions or other types of job conditions. And in particular, what we've observed is the fact that precarious employment seems to open the door for all sorts of other types of precarity. Some of the ones that I think are important are job precarity in terms of what one does and the idea that what you do on a day-to-day basis is relatively stable. Role precarity is about where you fit into the organization and whether you have a permanent location or a permanent title. Also the degree to which you can actually influence what the organization is doing. You have work precarity about whether you actually have a job or not, and the degree to which that job is stable and predictable and something that you can depend upon. You have skill precarity, whether you can actually use and gain skills from work. You have mobility precarity, the degree to which you can improve one's position within a firm or across firms. And equally important, whether you can even see that there's mobility available to you. And one of the characteristics of precarious work is that it seems to be kind of divorced or distanced from kind of traditional ways of thinking about movement within and between firms. And then finally, you have the idea of wage precarity, which is, do you actually earn enough to support everyday life? And obviously, all of these different concepts are things that people in the sociology of work and economic sociology and economic and labor studies have highlighted. But the point of the study of precarious work is that it sort of sees these things as all bundled together and reflective of a new condition. And that new condition is that there's just not the same stability to the type of work that one does that one would have seen in earlier generations and in earlier time periods. So what is our thesis here? Our thesis, quite simply, is that precarious work increases social marginality. Why does it increase social marginality? Because throughout the centuries in which we've talked about work, or the century and a half that we've talked about work, we've emphasized this idea that work is a way in which people are bound to society. It's a way in which people are connected to others. It's a way in which people sort of signal and inform others about what their position is and what they do. So when you have precarity in what you do, you suddenly start to lose these social ties. You start to lose these sort of cultural reference points. And ultimately that has an implication not for just how you see yourself, but how society sees you. And the essence of social integration and social marginality is this idea that people in society are connected in a dynamic way in which we signal to society who we are, and then society signals to us about who we are. And that ultimately creates social networks, it creates social ties, it creates kind of identities, it creates social locations. We argue that ultimately precarious work, because it undermines all these different aspects of the work relationship, ultimately is going to kind of disconnect people from those social connections, those social locations. Some things that we would highlight is that it undermines self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is this idea that you are an agentic person. You see yourself as someone who can operate in society. It clearly limits social networks, both in terms of size and diversity. One of the things about work that's quite different from things like schooling and like family and perhaps even like community and religious organization is networks within work are often diverse networks. You work with people who are different ethnicities, different ages, different educations, different social classes. So we see value in that would get disrupted if you suddenly had your work be less organized and less kind of non-ephemeral. It also shifts social identity, heightens stigma. There continues to be stigma around whether people are employed in the types of work that people do. And ultimately, it shifts values and priorities. And people have written about this in a number of different fields that Maslow in particular talked about this idea that values are kind of organized in a hierarchy in which people move from really lower order values that involve kind of self and survival to self and social actualization. Well, we would argue that with precarious work, you kind of get shoved back, and you get shoved back into that survival mode because you're constantly trying to figure out how to improve your work position. And you're also confronted with the idea that your conditions of everyday life are undermined by the fact that you have these poor quality jobs that aren't even dependable. One of the kind of ironies of kind of working class life is the fact that even if you knew that you weren't going to be compensated on a regular basis, for the vast majority of people, you at least knew you were going to be compensated, and you can expect a certain level of compensation. People in psychology will tell you that even things that are bad are not so bad if you can anticipate them and plan for them. It's when you can't plan for things that social life becomes problematic. So ultimately, this is our core thesis, that precarious work, because it fragments all these different aspects of the work relationship, ultimately will have externalities for how people exist in broader society. So we turn to kind of dream data, which is the European Social Survey. At present, there's about 440,000 observations going back to 2002. The data covers 38 countries. It's quite remarkable in the sense that for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, it asks a core set of questions about politics, about religion, about social beliefs and social attitudes, and then it has rotating modules that delve into specific aspects of things. And we capitalize on both of these in terms of thinking about precarious work and social marginality. So what is precarious work in the European Social Survey? We define it based on 5 things. The contract type that you have, differentiated between people who have no contract or a fixed term contract versus those that have an indefinite contract. We focus on job control, which is how much control over what you do, how much control you have over what you do. And importantly, job control is not necessarily captured by other aspects of socioeconomic position. There are a number of supervisors and managers who would argue that they have very little control over what they do because someone tells them how to supervise and someone tells them how to manage. So those traditional ways in which we've thought about organizing jobs don't necessarily capture this basic idea of asking people how much control do you have on what you do on a day-to-day basis. We also have the question of organizational influence. How much can you influence the direction of the firm that you're involved in? And we have chronic unemployment, which is people reporting that they're unemployed for 3 months or more. And then by virtue of all these other things, we would argue that financial vulnerability is a key aspect of precarious work, which is the ability to pay for costs of everyday life. What are the risk factors for precarious work? We focused on 3, which is sociodemographics, age, sex, marital status, nativity. We focus on family socioeconomic background, which is social class when you were 15 years of age, parents' education, and then we focus on the traditional measures of socioeconomic position, which are education, labor market position, income, and class position or occupational status. Here's just a real quick look at what the data shows. Precarious work is an IRT scale, so you can simply read it as going from low to high. Any bar that's heading up is telling you that risk is increased. Any bar that's heading down tells you that risk is lower. So if you look over on the far left-hand side, you can see that there's strong cohort differences. That the youngest cohort, which is people between the ages of 18 and 35, I believe, have much higher risk of precarious work, whereas the oldest cohorts, people between the ages of 56 and 65, much lower risk. You can also see that women have higher risk than men, and migrants have much higher risk than those that are native born. In terms of family class background, there's a strong gradient. This is the Goldthorpe scale. So the one that's sort of anomalous is farm labor at the far right. But if you look at the gradient going from the far left to the second to the far right, you can see a strong increase in the risk of precarious work. And then for parents' educational attainment, that if your parents had low levels of attainment, you've got higher risk. If they have high levels of attainment, you've got lower risk. Then we have educational attainment, household income, and social class, and all those show a strong socioeconomic gradient. So what you can see is that precarious work at least tracks with the traditional ways in which we've thought about advantage and disadvantage. So based on the fact that these are our risk factors, what gets ruled out in our analysis of the implications? All of these things get ruled out. So we're controlling for age, sex, marital status, nativity, social class, parents' education, and all the traditional socioeconomic indicators. And we use a hybrid fixed effects model that's sort of currently in vogue for dealing with this type of data. So we create bins of 25 people and look for deviations outside of those bins based on propensity scores. It's a way of having a fairly tight kind of lens on whether these things matter or not. So created box plots based on country means. So essentially what this does is it tells you the number of countries where the country average is low or high. And in each of the different cases, we have the 0 bar, which tells us that there is no effect. The first thing we look at is social integration. We've got 3 things. We've got how often do you meet socially? Do you have someone you can discuss things with, social support? And how often do you engage in social activities? And hopefully you can see that each of the boxes represents 50% of the countries. The whiskers on the boxes represent the 75th percentile range. And hopefully you can see that all of them are below 0, which means that the vast majority of countries have averages that show that more precarious work is associated with lower social integration. If we look at social psychological integration, we've got whether people think that they're part of a discriminated group, and that's above 0, indicating that if you are more exposed to precarious work, you're more likely to think that you're discriminated against. We ask the question, how emotionally attached are you to your country? You can see that the vast majority of country averages fall below. Again, a negative effect, increasing social marginality. If we look at attachment to Europe, it's even lower. And then another question is life on average for the average person in your country getting worse? And you can see that with more precarious work, you're more likely to see that life is getting worse. Generalized trust is a set of questions that ask people whether they are trustworthy, and the degree to which people are perceived as trustworthy, the degree to which people are perceived as fair, and the degree to which people are perceived as helpful. Again, we have 3 very large negative gradients there showing that more precarious work produces lower levels of generalized trust. Attitudes towards immigration, which we think is a nice proxy for intergroup relations. You can see that, and this is scaled so that higher values are indicating more negative values. We asked the question about whether the same people from the same ethnic group should be allowed to migrate to your country. More negative values for the vast majority of countries. For people of a different ethnic group, again, more negative values. For people from poor countries, even more negative values. So again, we're seeing this sort of increasing precarious work associated with social marginality. For political efficacy, on the far left, you've got the question, are you interested in politics? And interestingly, people with more precarious work express that they're more interested in politics. But if you ask people about whether they can have a say in politics, whether they can have a role in politics, whether the system allows them to participate or have a say, whether they're confident in their ability to participate, and whether politics is perceived as too complicated for them, all of those indicate kind of larger negative effects. More precarious work, less political efficacy. In terms of institutional trust, again, we see just a wide array of negative effects. More precarious work means you're less trustful of your local parliament. More precarious work, you're less trustful of your legal system. More precarious work, you're less trustful of politicians, political parties, the European Parliament, and the United Nations. So across a wide array of indicators, and there's more, there's about 25 others that I could have put, but I'm conscious of the time that we have here. People with lower levels of, people with more exposure to precarious trust are more likely to think there's going to be a terrorist attack. They're more likely to feel unsafe walking in their neighborhood at night. They're more likely to think that they're going to be a victim of a crime. The only arena where there seems to be kind of a balancing effect is they become more welfare oriented. And that to us is kind of fascinating that simultaneously people sort of become more concerned about socioeconomic inequalities, yet simultaneously feel more politically neutered in their ability to kind of, express that in a political context. So we've got 3 take-home messages, and then I'll call it. First, precarious work tracks with social disadvantage. It's higher among younger people, it's higher among women, it's higher among migrants, higher among people with lower educational attainment, and higher among people with lower kind of social class or socioeconomic positions in general. Second, precarious work is associated with widespread social marginality. It diminishes social contacts, it diminishes social support. It results in lower generalized trust, it results in lower institutional trust, it results in lower political efficacy, it results in greater anomia, and it fosters more negative intergroup relations. And then finally, if you think about these 2 kind of take-homes combined, the socio-demographics and the socioeconomics of risk seem to produce a vicious cycle, where those who are at increased risk of precarious work are also at heightened risk of social marginality. So these 2 factors seem to be compounding upon themselves to produce a particularly toxic situation. This is a nice policy forum, so I'll throw out some policy ideas. I think we need more interventions around non-precarious work, more interventions that would foster non-precarious work. The things that are in the literature are stronger labor protections, programs for skill enhancement, the integration of upskilling programs within firms. One of the problems with precarious work is people spend so much time upskilling outside of work that it tends to compete with work. Tax incentives for businesses that produce more durable and more inclusive types of work. I think we need more creative business models. I think we could do a lot to destigmatize unemployment, particularly as it's become more chronic and more cyclical. And finally, I think we could have stronger extra market supports. And if I had more time, I could talk about the broader welfare context, welfare state context around all this, because there's a very interesting story there as well. But I will stop there with one quick acknowledgement. I have 3 co-authors on this work: Arnstein Osve at Bocconi University, Leo Azzolini at Bocconi and Oxford, and Michael Shanahan at the University of Zurich. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ross, for your presentation. Really very rich and full of, oh yes, full of very good ideas. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. I see one. It's an anonymous attendee, but what about the welfare story? If you can reflect upon that a little bit already. I would like to add another question, Ross. So this whole trend towards precariousness that you described, do you think it may bounce back because of policies that are being considered in Europe, that the trend towards less precarious work, that we have reached a kind of a limit and it will turn? You have these discussions that we have in and changes that we have in, for instance, in the UK, where the Uber drivers now get a contract. You got Amazon staff that wants a trade union. There are discussions in my country, in the Netherlands, that this flexibility, which is another word for precariousness in a lot of cases, has reached its limit and should be taken very critically. So is there a possibility that it would bounce back? That's one thing. The other thing, when you speak about the impacts, you describe a lot of these negative impacts. What about resilience? I think that the precarious and the marginal people, my hypothesis would also be the ones that are less resilient, less able to cope with crisis and to deal with difficult situations. Your co-author Arnie Asve, of course, has published on that. So could you say a little bit about that? And the final question, because there is no more in the discussion, is the impacts on voting behavior. Is there do you have any information on say what people who are marginal, what it does for their voting? This morning we had a session on the right-wing parties. It could also be left-wing parties, but so if you have any information for that, that would be appreciated. So please
Sure.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. So in order, so first the welfare state story. The welfare state story is actually really interesting. There are no meaningful interactions that we've been able to find with respect to welfare state regimes or varieties of capital, and all the papers that we have that have gone under review, everyone brings this up and says, what's the welfare state story? And there are no meaningful interactions, but there are huge differences in the extent of precarious work. And it's a very strong gradient. Precarious work is very, very prevalent in Eastern European countries. So that's the Central Eastern European countries. Second is the Mediterranean context. Third is Anglo-Saxon, fourth is continental, and then Scandinavian countries have been best at sort of protecting exposure to precarious work. So there's a very, very strong gradient associated with precarious work that essentially is independent of the effects of precarious work and magnifies those effects. So that's an important part of the story. It doesn't seem to produce meaningful interactions, which I think leads to the second question that you raised, which is the question about how durable are these things. I have to admit I'm a little bit pessimistic, because I think that different types of welfare state varieties of capitalism are more vulnerable to flexibilization, as they're called. So the degree to which you get these neoliberal hegemonic policies that just come in. Eastern Europe's clearly been kind of overrun for the most part by this kind of managerial logic. So, I would expect that there would be a blowback in the Netherlands and maybe France and continental countries. I'm more pessimistic about Anglo-Saxon and Mediterranean and Eastern European. So I think we could see a sort of, a bifurcation of the vulnerability that's there. On the resilience issue, I think that's a fascinating question. And the work with Mike Shanahan the first paper focuses on self-rated health And we find very large negative effects, and we find the negative effects go through the social marginality vector. It's a paper that's forthcoming in Social Forces, I think the next issue. And then we have a second paper on depression, and we find very strong effects on depression. So I channel your thoughts exactly, which I think people in precarious work may be, somewhat battered to the point that they don't have the same level of resilience, and they don't have the same cognitive and physical tools in order to kind of deal with further shocks. And this entire system is about shocks. It's about the inability to control, large parts of your everyday existence. And then the voting thing, excellent question. And the work with Leo Azzolini, Bocconi and Oxford, we have a nice paper on voting behavior. And it shows that those exposed to precarious work tend to vote at a rate of about 10% less than others, and that there's no meaningful interactions that exist. So it just seems to be a very generic effect that cross-cuts generations and cohorts, men and women, migrants and non-migrants, people of different social classes. And we're currently expanding that into a broader paper that looks at political efficacy. So the degree to which people see the system as trustworthy and see the system as something that they would like to invest in. So we're very much kind of channeling your excellent questions that are there.
Okay, then one final one as a demographer. But
sure.
the size of the precarious population, could you have anything to say on that as a kind of?
So it depends. It's very strongly cohort driven. So the rough estimate I would give that if you were looking for people who were, 50% or 50% likelihood of being multifaceted precarity, so having 3 or 4 of these things, you're probably going to see 25 to 35% in the youngest cohorts, and in the oldest cohorts it's down 5 to 10%. It's about 5% higher for women than for men. Migrants, it's about 15% higher. And then the social class gradient is very, very large. So for people who are higher administration, self-employed, small employers, extent of precarity is close to 0, which may be a European phenomenon, that you just don't have the same level of risk that you have in more Anglo-Saxon contexts like the United States. But when you move down to routine work, you're looking at people where 50 to 60% of people are in precarious work. It's just the way in which the ability to enforce this flexibility in labor relations has tracked very closely with socioeconomic disadvantage and the decline of unionism. So all the routine and semi-skilled and unskilled labor jobs that used to have labor protections in the form of collective bargaining, that's been eroded so strongly over the last 2 decades that that's the group that's been most vulnerable to this.
Okay, thank you. I think we are going to have to leave it with that. We will continue the discussion in other fora, I'm very sure.